So with the release of every brand new Final Fantasy game, I think pretty much since Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy 12, is the question of, is this the future of Final Fantasy? Is this Final Fantasy enough for the Final Fantasy diehards? And I think Final Fantasy 16 specifically is the hardest case to make for a Final Fantasy game. It's the one that aims to kind of stray far away from tradition while still kind of honoring and respecting tradition. So in today's video, I kind of want to ask the question, is Final Fantasy 16 a true Final Fantasy game? Is it Final Fantasy enough for you guys? Do me a favor, you guys, if you enjoy this type of video, please consider subscribing, as it does help me out tons. If you like this video specifically, please like this video or dislike it if you don't. Let me know what you guys think down below, and with that, let's get into this video. Alright, in order to find out if Final Fantasy 16 meets the criteria of a Final Fantasy game, we first have to kind of figure out what a Final Fantasy game is. And I feel like depending on who you ask, they're all going to have different takes on it. I think originally when we heard this was going to stray far away from turn-based and be a true action Final Fantasy game, not like Final Fantasy 15, not like Final Fantasy 7 Remake, but a completely new Final Fantasy action-adventure game, people were mixed as far as what that meant for the future. It's very clear that Square Enix has no interest in making Final Fantasy a turn-based game. With that being said, games like Final Fantasy 15, games like Final Fantasy 7 Remake still utilized a menu-based style system that allowed for this new move into action adventure style combat game a little bit more palatable, I think, for the more traditional Final Fantasy fans. I think when people think of like the Final Fantasy style combat, they always think of turn-based and specifically menu style combat, where you kind of just shift through menus and you choose whatever you want. Final Fantasy 16 is the first true move into not just an action RPG, but more so into an action adventure game. I think Final Fantasy 16 is trying to do something completely new, something completely innovative, which Final Fantasy has always been kind of striving for, but it's always that kind of like, when is changing the formula too much change for a franchise? Whenever you have a decade-old franchise, something like Final Fantasy, there's definitely things that fans come to expect from that game, from that franchise, and turn-based has been one of the things that stuck closely by Final Fantasy. I mean, they pretty much invented the whole menu style turn-based system and innovated it with ATB systems and etc., stuff like that. Final Fantasy 15 and 17 Remake still honored that turn-based style by having menu selects within your combat. Final Fantasy 16 completely drops all of that in favor of actions being tied to a specific button, allowing you to do things like combos, links. But I think the question a lot of people are asking themselves is this move into like a more action adventure combat game mean that it completely dropped everything that made Final Fantasy Combat? And I'd argue no. I know a lot of people want to say yes, and I definitely want to argue the case that even though this is an action-adventure game, more so than it is an action RPG, it definitely still pulls a lot of things from Final Fantasy. Things like using special techniques, things like using the magic system. They still have things like potions and high potions. You have all your traditional like wordage and verbiage that you would expect from Final Fantasy. It's just now it's in more real time, and you kind of have to think faster and quicker. I think this was what Final Fantasy's kind of always been trying to do, and that kind of shows in the ATB system they used to have back then. For you guys who don't know the ATB system, how it worked was everyone had a specific bar that'll load up underneath their health bar. And how that'll work was once your ATB gauge was full, it meant it was your time to choose an action. And during your time of choosing an action, the enemy would also be allowed to continue attacking you. So if you waited too long to choose an action, you would actually just end up being punished by the enemy, which is very similar to what Final Fantasy 16's combat system is, where if you take too long to react to something, you're gonna get punished for it. You're gonna get punished hard by the enemy. It's very similar, in my opinion, to what the ATB system was trying to create. Just now it's more real time and it's more reactionary based than it is kind of just making the right decision. One of the biggest callouts and criticisms that Final Fantasy's combat system has been getting from traditional Final Fantasy fans is that traditionally in Final Fantasy games, how magic and elemental attacks would work is that you would have super effective damage for certain things that are weak against specific elements, and other things that would actually heal the enemy. So for example, the bombs, which has kind of become the talking point of this right now, is that in most Final Fantasy games, if you attacked a fire bomb with fire magic, it actually ended up healing them versus doing damage. And in this game, it just kind of doesn't have any different effect. It does the exact same thing essentially as any other normal magic would do, which is starting to cause a lot of kind of conversation that maybe they should have kept the whole elemental thing, the whole weaknesses. And I kind of agree with that. I understand that, yeah, that would have been really cool. I do see, however, how that'll kind of change the focus of what combat is in this game. I think they, with their whole approach to being a completely action combat game instead of like a more menu-based action RPG game, is that they added a lot of depth in the combo system, in how you kind of fight and interact with enemies. And I think adding the whole elemental thing would just add a whole nother layer of complexity to what's already somewhat a complex fighting system. And as I played through the game, I can kind of see how that'd be more annoying if you kind of had to make sure you switched out specific magics just to fight a very simple enemy like a bomb. Like, traditionally in other Final Fantasy games, fighting something like a bomb and elemental or flan, yeah, you want to make sure you're focusing in on which specific magic you're using against them, but you also had a lot more time to kind of think and choose your actions wisely, versus in this game, everything's happening at you so fast, you don't even really have time to say, all right, we're fighting a bomb, let's switch this out between this magic. Especially if sometimes you're fighting like a soldier and a bomb at the same time. If you were to have to like switch in between like targets based off whoever's near you and like switch your magic, all that kind of stuff, it can get very convoluted very, very fast. And I think at a certain point you kind of would lose the depthness in what makes this combat system so fun and so frenetic. Is it something in maybe next installment in Final Fantasy, can they maybe work on making a way to make it work out? Yeah, definitely. I think there's definitely ways to improve on that, as far as just like still including some of the old traditional Final Fantasy fans along for this ride of action adventure. But I don't think it's really a detriment to Final Fantasy 16 currently, as honestly, I don't really miss it. It's not something that I ever came to a Final Fantasy game saying, yay, I get to use elemental magic against certain things. It was just what was part of those specific systems, because they're very like strategic and thought-provoking as far as like what decision is going to be the right choice, versus this one is definitely a lot more reactionary. And when it comes to reactionary style combat, you want to make sure that there's a very strict focus on it. And in this game, the focus is on the combat, it's on switching between icons, it's not which magic you're using on specific enemies. And again, whether you like that or not, I don't really see it as like a huge departure from Final Fantasy, as far as saying that this is not a Final Fantasy game because elemental magic does not do specific damage to specific enemies. Alright, let's talk about the next, I think, big contention as far as this game being a Final Fantasy game, and it's the lack there of the party system. So in most Final Fantasy games, you'd have like a party that you'd travel around the world with, you guys will destroy evil together, and you'd command each party member. As games kind of evolved and Final Fantasy combat systems have grown more complex, the ability to control your extra party members, your allies, has definitely dropped. Like Final Fantasy 12, you had the Gambit system, where you would kind of set what you would want them to do ahead of time. That way you wouldn't have to really focus on what they were doing. You just know they were always doing the right thing. Final Fantasy 13 also spread away from that. Final Fantasy 15 kind of had their weird way around it. Overall, most Final Fantasy games since Final Fantasy 12 has definitely strayed away from the whole you controlling every member of your party at each time. So Final Fantasy 16 kind of really is the furthest departure from having any control of your party, essentially. Your party is usually you and Torgal, your dog, and then whoever is the companion of your kind of the storyline right now. So whether that be your female companion, Sid in this game, whoever is with you in the story is kind of your party member, quote unquote, for the time being. but they kind of really just help in doing some like extra side damage. They don't really do things as far as like helping you heal yourself. So for a lot of people, they're not really being like a set party or like just a more real party system in this game. Is definitely their way of saying this isn't a Final Fantasy game for those reasons. I'm gonna argue against that a little bit. I do think in old school Final Fantasy games, the party system was a huge factor in those games. It helped aiding in things like strategizing and making combat feel more fleshed out and adding variety to your specific characters and helping out in the stories. With all that being said, as complicated as systems are getting, and Final Fantasy 16 probably being the most complicated action adventure style Final Fantasy game we've ever really seen, the depthness and the variety in the combat comes with just Clive himself. He doesn't really need a party to kind of add that variety in combat. He doesn't need a party to kind of help strategize, as you kind of just strategize yourself based off of how you switch your icon abilities and how you kind of want to combo your enemies and your accessories and stuff like that. So I don't think adding more party members would help enrich the specific combat system that Final Fantasy 16 has. And I think Final Fantasy 16 was very gung-ho on, they want their combat system to be what it is. And if they were to do something like add a party member that was more focused on you commanding them, it would definitely take away from what you could do with Clive at any given moment. Would doing something like add a gambit system helped? Maybe. But at the same time, I think a lot of people got turned off by Final Fantasy 12 because of that gambit system. So I think, again, in their way of making Final Fantasy more accessible, Final Fantasy 16 more widely appealing to a broader audience, dropping the whole you controlling your party system, I think, had to be done as far as the combat goes. I think they didn't drop the most important part of the party system, though. In most Final Fantasy games, that party system was there to help flesh out the story. It was there to help support the main protagonist. It was there to help flesh out the world. And in the cutscenes in this game, you definitely get that. You get that the party system, the party characters that you have, whether it be Jill, whether it be Joshua, whether it be Sid, whoever you're talking to at the moment, in those cutscenes, are so real, so genuine, so story built, that I don't think the most important part of the party system is lost in this game. And that is them being additional characters to help flesh out the world and help flesh out your main protagonist. And again, those are my favorite parts about having a party in Final Fantasy, is that whole communication amongst each other's characters, the whole communication with each character in the world, and we definitely get that in this game, and that hasn't been lost. So again, the most important part of the party to me was always that. I think another thing that kind of bothers me about what a lot of people say about the party system is that they say that characters kind of come and go throughout the story, and yeah, that's true, but I don't think that's really too far away from what Final Fantasy games have done in the past. Games like Final Fantasy 4, you would kind of really just follow Cecil's story, and as the characters kind of like hopped in and made sense in Cecil's story, they were part of the party, and you'd kind of lose some people every now and again. And that was kind of just part of the game's story, and it kind of enriched Cecil's experience. And I feel like that's a lot of what I see in Final Fantasy 16, is that, again, it's very Clive focused, and the parties that kind of join in on his like journey are people that are more relevant to his specific story, are more relevant to kind of supporting him up as a character, more so than like you would get in like Final Fantasy 6 or Final Fantasy 5, where the party was kind of like very much focused in on each character, and each character having like their own really deep story. And not to say that Final Fantasy 16 or Final Fantasy 4's characters didn't have their own very specific deep backstories, they just weren't as fleshed out as the main protagonist was. The last thing I really want to hark on, the last thing I want to kind of touch, is exploration in this game. I think a lot of people have this idea that Final Fantasy is this huge, big, open world. And I don't know. I think when you look at like the earlier days of like the pixel art, like Final Fantasy 1 through 6, yeah, they were open world, but I think that was just like made sense during those times, especially the same thing like 7, 8, and 9. But as technology grew better and the worlds were more deep and more detailed, it was harder to create those same open worlds. So Final Fantasy X was our first kind of far departure from what an open world was. It was a very linear story that worked point from point to point. And even when you finally got the airship, it was more just an overview map, and you'll just pick on your specific location you want to land on. Final Fantasy 12 did open world better, but I feel like Final Fantasy 12 is more reminiscent of what Final Fantasy 16 is. They're more compatible, I think. I think Final Fantasy 12 open world did really well for what PlayStation 2 was able to do, but it was a bunch of just smaller maps kind of connected by loading screens. It wasn't a true open world like you would get from Elden Ring or Breath of the Wild. And the real like modern day Final Fantasy game that was a true open world was Final Fantasy 15. And I don't think the open world benefited that game. I think things like the combat system, things like the story, things like the characters really got lost in that open world. You had this big, beautiful open world with nothing to do in it, and the characters kind of suffered for it. I think Final Fantasy 16's decision to not go open world and go more into like a segmented world was definitely a smart choice, because now they were able to focus in heavily on the story, focus in on the deep combat, focus in on the characters, make these things feel more lively. That way the world feels more full, feels more alive, feels more worth journeying through and kind of going through this story with. And it's not to say that there is no like form of exploration. It's not very corridor focused like Final Fantasy 13, where it was essentially just a straight line until the end of the game. There are areas where you can kind of branch away and kind of go your own way around things, but it's not going to be like in Breath of the Wild where you're climbing mountains, or Elden Ring where you can just go underneath everything and find all these different hidden areas. It is very much so. This area that you're given is the arena that you're kind of exploring, but there's definitely limits to that area. And again, I don't hate that. I kind of really like that in Final Fantasy 16 right now. Ultimately, if we were to circle back to the original question, is Final Fantasy 16 a real Final Fantasy game? Is it a true mainline installment into the Final Fantasy game? Honestly, I think that's a stupid question. I think no shit, this is a Final Fantasy game. It breathes Final Fantasy. Because to me, when I think of Final Fantasy, I don't think turn-based. I don't think elemental damages. I don't think job system. I think of a whole bunch of quality experiences kind of tied into one umbrella. I think of a very detailed, enriching, complicated narrative that makes me feel something at the end of the day. I think of characters that help me feel the gravity of the situation that they're going in, that help me root for them and make me want to see the end of their story. I think of a world that feels lively, that feels so full of character. And Final Fantasy 16 has all this and then some. You have characters that are so full and enriching, from the NPCs to the main protagonist to the antagonist to everyone that's kind of just delivering their lines with such gravitas. Makes me just fall in love with this world and makes me kind of want to explore the little things that I want to do. Makes me want to do these random side quests that really don't do anything except add lore to the game. This is why I play Final Fantasy games. It's for the narrative. It's for the quality experience. It's for the tie-in from the gameplay to the storyline that really makes me feel something. It's an experience unlike any other. And I think Final Fantasy 16 is chock full of things that make Final Fantasy, from the world to the characters to the creatures to the bosses to just the overall grandeur that Final Fantasy has always been. And that's what I love Final Fantasy for, and that's why I like Final Fantasy 16, and why I think it is a true next adventure in what Final Fantasy is. Is there problems with it? God, yes. There's problems with every Final Fantasy game. There's problems with every game ever invented. Are there things that they can do to kind of ease in more traditional Final Fantasy fans? Yes. Should they try doing that on the next installment? Yeah. I think Final Fantasy 17 should take this and see how they can kind of bridge in some of the older Final Fantasy fans that they maybe lost along the way. But overall, I do think this encapsulates what Final Fantasy is trying to be and what Final Fantasy has always been.